Jules, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for coming on. Could you give the party people a quick intro of who you are?
So I guess general and science mixed all together, because that's kind of what my streams kind of have been. So my name is Jules. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a queer Latina, and I have been streaming now for about 3.5 years on Twitch. I started off with more cozy, soft content, kind of like Animal Crossing, but my brain loves to think about many different things and not get stuck on one thing. And that's kind of when I started playing a lot of other fantasy RPG games. But then when I got into my master's program in 2022, I realized that I was not going to be able to do that and Twitch unless I made a change. And so I started integrating more co-working into a lot of my Twitch content, which if you don't know what co-working is, co-working/coexisting is basically I host an online study space. Our little like cat cafe is what we call our community here. We have Pomodoros, which are set timers to work to and set break times to avoid burnout. And we do that for several hours, 3 out of the 5 days. Honestly, at one point it was a lot more than that because I needed to get stuff done for my thesis. And my thesis, at least the most recent one, was a Master's of Science in Parks, Rec, and Tourism. Social science didn't really have like the best categories. We kind of were lumped into a bunch of things because social science and sciences kind of, when it comes to parks, rec, and tourism, it can be really hard to group together in colleges. So I kind of ended up under that umbrella, but it was on specifically more environmental justice and urban planning, which I can get into later. But my background is in wildlife biology. That's the thing that kind of kicked off my passion for the environmental sciences, and I'm very excited to talk about that. Aside from that, I guess that's the rundown so far.
Nice. So what got you into sciences to begin with? So some of the past guests that we've had on had mentioned like taking apart stuff or just like a natural inclination of like animals in the wild. What got Jules excited in the sciences?
It's kind of funny because I was talking to my husband about this the other day. He's an engineer. He always loved Legos and taking apart and building things. I did not like any of that stuff. To me, I found a lot of peace growing up. Just being outside, honestly. I grew up in the city and then I grew up kind of right outside of the city. So I felt like typically the hustle and bustle was a little draining and overstimulating. And so I often found myself finding a little corner or going to a park and reading a lot. I also grew up outside of Washington, D.C., which obviously we have the Smithsonian. So we have the National Zoo that I could just walk into whenever I really wanted to because it's free entry. Just don't ever park near there. It's so expensive. And then, of course, we also have all of the museums that are also free. That also blew my mind because when I left DC, I didn't realize that you had to pay for museums because I had been so privileged growing up there my whole life. But I think a big thing for me was I just fell in love with animals. I've always loved animals. My dad and my mom would volunteer to take us to museums with like our little groups, that we would go to in school. And I don't really know how it happened. I think I just felt really connected to animals specifically. I loved nature in general. But I remember one of the first books I ever begged my dad for, which he still has, it's torn apart, it's like his prized possession in his room, is like an encyclopedia of mammals from the Natural History Museum in Washington, D.C. So I was definitely a big nerd. I remember I would just try and memorize facts. No one told me to. I just thought it was fun to tell people facts about animals. So
that's awesome. Okay, so we got to ask, what's your favorite animal?
Oh, see, or
5. You can give me 5 of them.
5.
You don't have to rank them or anything. Make it easier.
Okay, I would say a golden eagle is up there. I would say a cat, a dolphin. I'm trying to think of maybe a few others. Ooh. See, I'm a big cat person. This is the thing. I'm going to try not to pick only like felines. I would say I love sharks, especially my favorite. I love hammerhead sharks. I'm obsessed with hammerhead sharks. I'm terrified. Like I would never want to be in the water with a shark, but I love going to aquariums or just like reading about them or watching documentaries about them. So hammerhead shark, and then let's see. I would say ornate box turtles, and I can talk about that later. But I did work with them, so I kind of I never like loved or like turtles. I thought they were cute, but I kind of grew to love them a lot because I ended up working with them at one point. So
all right, we gotta delve into that too, because one of the things right that we commonly hear about is like a certain kind of organism that people work on in the lab, like a fruit fly or yeast or fungus. Yeah. The moment someone pulls out something exotic like a turtle turtle. I'm like, oh, I want to hear about this. Like, let us know about what's going on with this turtle. Okay, so Jules was always interested in animals. How did you then decide what to go to college for and what to get that original degree in? And how did you make that decision of like going towards like conservation work?
Honestly, I knew it was always what I wanted to do. I think the problem, I don't even know if it's a problem. I think it's more so that it's so unknown in the world of environmental science, and wildlife biology is so big that for me, initially, I thought, okay, the way that I can work with wildlife, especially exotic wildlife, would be I would just have to become an exotic veterinarian, because I thought that was kind of the only way outside of just manifesting and becoming the next Steve Irwin. So I ended up going to college for veterinary medicine. But then while I was at college, I realized, hey, I don't know if I really want to treat animals. I'd rather kind of research them instead and learn a little bit more. And so, like the first semester I was in college, they had one of those career fair type situations. And I just walked around there thinking about what I wanted to do. And US Fish and Wildlife and a few other people had a conversation with me that kind of changed the trajectory of everything that I'd been working towards. They were like, yeah, wildlife biology, here's all this research that you can do. They kind of opened my eyes that working with animals isn't just, you don't have to just be a veterinarian for it. You can do research, you can do all sorts of stuff with them, even like science communication with them. And from there, the very next day, they told me, well, in that conversation, they told me we had a wildlife conservation degree and a wildlife bio degree. So the next day I transferred and I left animal science and veterinary medicine and just never looked back, because I just found my people, honestly. So that's was kind of an impulsive decision looking back, but I think I knew that it just felt right and that's what I needed.
It kind of feels like your life had built up to that point where it was like almost a perfect fit, right? Like how you're describing the love of animals. I love the story about your dad with the book as well. It's like it was meant to be, right? So what does that degree entail in terms of like, can you break down like what does it mean to have this kind of degree? Like what are you actually learning to do? And what did you have to do to get that degree? Did you have to do lab work for that? Is that where the box turtles were coming in? So what did that mean overall in terms of a journey?
Not to gas up Virginia Tech. That's where I did my undergrad. So go Hokies. I will say that their wildlife program is probably one of the best. I'm not biased, but it was very well-rounded and interdisciplinary. And so we did things from habitat management, and it was really cool because when we were there, more than half my classes were outside. And so we were always doing something very hands-on. Of course, we had our traditional kind of like basic classes, lab work, chem, like all those things that you kind of need in most science degrees, at least the biological chem sciences, that kind of propel you and advance you forward. But we would also, I had a dendrology class, identifying plants, we did mammalogy, ornithology, ichthyology. We did all sorts of different things like that. We did human wildlife conflict as well, because when you work with animals, especially wild animals that are constantly getting into people's things, which is going to happen, you have to learn how to deal with it and talk about it. And so it really ranged from everything. We did small mammal traps. We had a really cool course called Wildlife Field Techniques, which is basically, I think it was 10 days out in like the Appalachian Mountains near us. And we did big rotations there. It was really nice. We had campfires and stuff at the end of every day. We'd trap mammals. We would go mist netting for birds. We would do herp hunts at night. We would do like fishing. We would do all sorts of different things to learn about different animals and basically run through all of the basics. We even learned how to, one of my weirdest skills is knowing how to tranquilize an animal with a blow dart. So you would learn basically anything you needed with any type of work you wanted to go into in that major. It's really cool. And I think that it's just something that you need to kind of have when you're a wildlife biologist in a way. Like sometimes you're in a lab, you need those skills, but sometimes you're also out in the middle of nowhere and you need to know kind of how to survive as well. So we did learn, plants you could eat or things that you could do. Not that I remember many of them now. I was never really the best at my plants, but I did learn about a chicken fungus that was really good and tasted really yummy. A few tea berries here and there. But yeah, so I think it's really a well-rounded type of major that you go into, and I probably forgot the rest of that question.
So I have 30 other questions now on all this. So before we go on the science side, how do you learn about using a blow dart? Like, do you do like in a little bit in the classroom and then you're doing in the wild? Like, what was the process for that?
So the good thing is with the blow darts and everything, so they had things that we would work on actual animals with and others that they were like, you're probably too inexperienced to do this immediately. So for example, mist netting, like small mammal traps, stuff like that, we would do that with actual animals. We would set like bear traps. We would not catch bears as a class, like not at all. For the blow darts, and we even used like pistols, like the tranquilizer pistols and stuff, it would always be like moving fake deer targets type situation things, but they're just ensuring that you could hit your shot basically. So those, I think that they did the smart thing, because I definitely wouldn't want to hit something in the wrong place, but I'd rather train on something before going to the real thing. Also, when we were learning about that, I personally was like, I don't think I'm ever going to use this. But if someone else does, that's great. I don't think that's like what I wanted to do, but I do think it's a cool story to talk about.
That's there are folks in the chat mentioning like, I've known Jules for a while and she's never mentioned this.
I told them if they wanted to know stuff about my wildlife things, that things would come out today. So
the breadth of things that you learned during this degree is quite incredible. What do you felt like it was a challenge? Because it seems like it's a lot of different things. Like, not only are you learning survival, right? Like eating the right kind of mushroom in case you're stuck out there, but what are other things that you felt like were critical that you learned on this journey in wildlife conservation? Like particular examples, like, was it bird calls? Was it the trap holding? Like, what were the really big things that really stick out to you?
I think there were definitely like fun things like bird calls, or a lot of those like learning how to handle animals, or learning how to like just how to kind of spot invasive species, etc., like with habitat management. I think those were kind of, at least to me, the fun things. I think the more important things were a lot of like the behind the scenes stuff of wildlife biology, probably like biostatistics and some coding, or even honestly, a lot of people in my degree, and I think it's important to talk about, we would have human dimensions of fish and wildlife. And it's funny, we don't like measure people. We're like, it's about the human side of wildlife conservation. And a lot of people in my degree thought that it was useless information, learning about kind of human wildlife conflicts, because a lot of them were like, my goal is to get into US Forest Service, do my research, never see any human beings ever, which is very rare. Most jobs in wildlife conservation and biology, you have to deal with people. And if you work with animals and if you care about animals, you're going to have to deal with people eventually. And I think that that was something really important that I didn't know existed until those courses were kind of added, and they were added in my senior year. So we ended up having to take them. And I think that it was great that we had to take them, because it taught me a lot of things. It kind of propelled me towards my master's, honestly. But I think a lot of other people needed to hear it too. And I think it's important to also acknowledge how much change we can do when we incorporate people into the wildlife side of science too.
Could you give us a couple of examples of what you found were like really, really important? Because I feel like that is something that seems a little bit alien, right? Of like, I went into wildlife conservation, like it makes sense. Ornithology, the fish, the bear traps, even the blow dart. The human side, like you said, you're explaining it, makes total sense. But what were some really big key takeaways, do you think?
Ooh, I think the biggest takeaway for me in a general stance is that making large changes and large jumps to save a species, to save an area, save a reserve, it all ends up going back, and somebody's going to have to read and approve or read and research, etc., to get things moving. The biggest things that we were talking about were, we lived in a pretty rural area in Blacksburg. If you don't know where Blacksburg is, look it up. It's in the middle of nowhere. It's a mountain town in Virginia Tech. Basically, it's the college campus and then not much around us, except like Jefferson National Forest. A lot of people, would have farms. Their animals would get attacked by coyotes or other things, and people have issues with it. But when you're trying to save coyotes or research coyotes or also save farm animals and do all this stuff, you have to kind of be the bridge between that and figure out how to best even like do your research when stuff like that is happening. So for me, a big takeaway overall is that there really can't be much change without dealing with people. Sometimes it's legal and sometimes it's not. Sometimes even if you want to work on an animal, you're going into private property. Like it could even be something as simple as your species that you are responsible now in your PhD. You have to go and ask for permission to go into somebody's backyard because a lake is there or something. And it can be from that all the way to there's a conflict, all the way to, hey, congressperson, I need you to actually take me seriously. And here's why, and understand the need and how to communicate your science to get an actual thing to happen. So I think a lot of people, when they think about wildlife, they think, okay, I'm just going to work with my animal. And if I work on my animal, I will save this animal versus, hey, to do that at a grander scale, think about the bigger picture as well.
It's one of those things that without public buy-in, you can't do what you're setting out to do. And so that's why one of these things is critical to be able to learn.
Mm-hmm.
That is a really cool take. And it also, like, I like how you said too, it makes you a good science communicator. Like, you have to, right? If you don't get that buy-in and you can't explain the concepts appropriately, no one's going to play ball and want to be part of it, right?
Yeah, exactly.
You also mentioned that there's other back-end stuff that you had to do. So before we get into the field work that you were doing, like biostatistics and coding, could you talk a little bit about what that was like? And that seems, again, maybe intuitively a little bit on the other side of things. Like, you're not getting your hands dirty with the bear traps, you're coding. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so probably the thing that made me realize that I need math a lot more than I thought in wildlife biology was population dynamics and mapping. So especially if you're looking at one species, one population, you can't just like go in and be like, hey, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, they're all here. Let's go send 4 more people to follow them and see how they're doing, etc., to observe. You have to basically use a lot of technology to actually do that. And so a lot of it is learning like Python and R. I mostly use R. I'm not really great at it. I still want to learn Python. That's the one that I never got into. My choice was R. I also did ArcGIS, a lot of mapping for landscapes, boundaries, trying to see like where in a reserve you are, etc., for animal tracking. So I think a lot of it has to do with not even just movement of animals or counts of animals, whether something's threatened or endangered, but even when you're in a lab, things start to get really mathematical really fast, especially when you start looking at things like physiology, all of the inside workings of an animal. You're not a vet, but you probably do want to understand how those animals are being impacted by things around them, what they're eating, etc. You can have your specialty, but at the end of the day, you're probably going to have to do some sort of map or some sort of math in general with it. So there is a lot of other things that kind of go into being a wildlife biologist too. I like saying we're kind of like a jack of all trades field because I feel like a lot of people don't realize like all of the weird stuff we have to get into, but also all of the technical and normal things we have to do as well. I think it's good and bad because Steve Irwin's like one of my idols. I think it's great seeing documentaries like that. That's the stuff that like got me into wildlife as well, But you didn't really see him coding and like scratching his head in a lab. But that is stuff that we have to do too, and you can avoid it sometimes depending on your job, but not a lot. So
yeah, I mean, that's how when you were describing even the courses that you were taking, I'm like, oh my gosh, she's doing everything. Because right, usually like, at least for me, it was like, all right, lab work, you're in the lab, and then you're not doing the fieldwork side of things, and you're also doing the fieldwork side of things, and then you're also doing the wet bench and dry bench. So with the mathematics and the bioinformatics behind it, like, yeah, that training seems really, really intense. Can you comment on like what to you did you feel like was the most rewarding part in that learning experience? Because again, that is so diverse. But what was the most fun for you?
I think the most fun for me, and I always recommend, because like my thing with wildlife biology is I'm a first-gen college student as well. I'm also a first-gen American. So when I was, especially, if any like POC child parents are in the chat, that they were like doctor or lawyer. And when I said wildlife biology, they were like, what are you doing? And of course, like I already, there's like a more linear path, I feel like, to being a doctor than there is to being a wildlife biologist in many cases. But I would say probably the coolest things for me, the things that I want to ungatekeep from like wildlife biology and wildlife conservation is doing external internships, doing things like that really like help you understand whether or not this is something that you want to do. That was probably the most fun for me. Texas A&M's job board for wildlife biology is like the creme de la creme of like finding a whole bunch of stuff. That's probably like my go-to. That's like start there. And then from there, you can find a whole bunch of other places. I found a lot of my internships that way, but I would say probably the most rewarding things were just kind of getting my feet wet in different things and realizing what I liked and didn't like about them until I kind of found my groove or found the things that I liked. I started off with U.S. Fish and Wildlife, an internship with them. So I worked with them for a summer. That's where I did ornate box turtle work. I was basically responsible for trying to keep track of them because we were trying to do population dynamics of them and their species. And they basically have these little backpacks that you can track with radio telemetry. So I would have this giant antenna looking thing and I would go trying to track their numbers and to see if they're still alive, how they're doing. And they would often get caught up and they would bury themselves too far under the ground. And I would have to dig giant holes to get them out so they wouldn't kill themselves. So,
whoa. Like, all right, wait, okay, super cool, super cool. So what was, I guess, the original question, right? Like, what was the question that you were trying to, like, population dynamics, but like, was it in danger? Like, why are you looking at, why would they bury themselves? Is this a natural part of the behavior? Like, what?
It's natural because in Illinois where I was in Savannah, Illinois. It's like 200 or less population. It was in the middle of nowhere. And it's probably like the scariest, but one of the coolest experiences ever. I had to wear steel-toed boots. I was just sweating constantly in the internship. But I think it was my first time basically being like, hey, this is what a wildlife biologist feels like. But basically our overall support to U.S. Fish and Wildlife at that point was, hey, are these animals threatened and how are their populations doing in Illinois? Because we keep losing track of them. They're kind of appearing a little bit less in the state and prairie areas. So can you check up on them and basically do a report on them? And so I basically got this, oh God, the story's going to get weirder. So I was, oh my God, where was I? I forgot the actual name, but it was I wouldn't say wildlife reserve is the right name because U.S. Fish and Wildlife has a specific term for them. But basically it was this area that U.S. Fish and Wildlife manages. It used to be like a war zone, I guess, a very long time ago, like during like World War II and World War I. And they told me, hey, you need to do research on these turtles because a lot of them are here, but also beware of mustard gas that still may be in the area. So they had like set trails for me to follow. And just, I guess what the wildlife would encounter. But my whole thing was, again, keeping track of their numbers. Each one had a number, and then I ended up naming them because you're not supposed to, but you get attached to your animals. So, of course, I did. And I would basically check up on them all summer. And then the report that I did would be compared to the report the person did the following year. And then that's kind of how they would track it. Is yearly interns would do this, and then we would check the rates of those turtles in that specific area where they're already being mostly unbothered outside of mustard gas, and see how they're doing. And we combine those with other studies across Illinois. And that's kind of how they did their reporting there. But it was a cool experience, but it was also really, really silly because, again, everywhere I went, I feel like we kind of encountered random stuff, but it kind of made the job more fun. And again, like, I can't wait till maybe I have future kids to tell them, like, hey, yeah, I did all this really cool stuff. Let me tell you about it.
It is really Jules, you just told us that you're steel-toed searching for turtles in mustard gas laden fields. Like, that is, like, if you're already not labeled as a badass, like, I hope that people know, right? That is really, really cool. I'm also just shocked at the fact there's just mustard gas lying out in Illinois, just like where you're just told to go out.
They were trying to get like conservation crews out there to try and, because it's a long process when it comes to chemicals and war. Those things take such a long time to just get rid of, or to, I guess, like, I don't know if diffuse is the right word, but dispose of properly. And so they had done a pretty good job and they've been working on it for a really long time. But also I think that's where I also learned just implications of war on the environment too, because I was like, oh my God, what do you mean there's mustard gas here?
Yeah, that again seems a little out of place. Like, there shouldn't just be mustard gas lying around. But it's incredible, even the technology that you were able to use. Like, the turtles are presumably tagged, and then you got to use sensors to find them, and then you had to also dig them up. And I understand naming them too. Like, how are you not gonna name them? Did you have a favorite turtle?
Number 16. His name was Lenny.
I love that you just had the answer right away. I love that so very much.
I remember him. I think the reason, he at first he wasn't my favorite, and then he became my favorite because the first time I held him, he peed all over me. But afterwards, we grew a very nice bond, and I liked fun. He usually was always in the same place. He made my life very easy the rest of the time I was there, versus others did not make my life easy.
Yeah, why why did they dig too deep? Like if they're threatening their lives of digging, like, do you know why they were digging so deep?
They usually dig to escape predators at night, from what I remember. The problem is that sometimes if the dirt moves, because the soil was kind of loose there, and that was one of the issues, is that sometimes they'd almost get buried, and you don't want to like bury alive, and they would keep trying to like dig up, but then they would get stuck because they're kind of tubby. And so it was kind of one of those things where it didn't happen very frequently, but it's unfortunately just something that happens to turtles that tend to dig, or animals that dig underground, is sometimes if something shifts above you, you can't really control it. And so we were trying to do our best to be like, hey, let's not lose any of our test subjects / wonderful animals that we're taking care of. So
not a side effect of the mustard gas, as far as we're okay. That is such a cool internship, though. That's like, and so were you responsible for your collection of the data? Did you also have to analyze the data as well? So were you learning again both sides of data collection?
Yeah, a bit. I would say that I learned a little bit about data collection there. More so, I feel like entry and organization, especially of like large data sheets, because basically I would take what everybody else did, add mine, compare it, reorganize it, instead of kind of have my own and then do like a whole report, because it was such a long study. I think I learned more of analysis in my next internship, which was with NOAA, so the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. That one I had focused more on, I was interested in physiology and stress responses and nutrition of animals. And that's the one where I think, well, definitely was probably one of the most challenging internships I've done, but also the most rewarding, where we collected our own data, analyzed everything, did a report, did a presentation in front of like NIST and NOAA, like federal like agency people that were there to listen to us about all sorts of stuff. And that was really, really intense, but it was very worth it. I think that it was cool. It was almost like the scientific process kind of showing itself in full versus kind of stopping a little bit early with the other internship, which is, again, why I think doing many internships, especially increasing in challenge, is so nice, because you kind of get to learn, like, did I like this part of it? What's my favorite part? Because sometimes you can tailor what you do to be your favorite part of the scientific method.
Can you tell us about that internship? Like, what was the question that you were asking? What was the organism that you were working on? Tell us about it.
So for that one, it's funny. I actually originally applied for that internship because it was with many different postdocs, actually, at the College of Charleston. And it was their research experience for undergraduates. And I had applied to work with dolphins there because we were in South Carolina. I was on Charleston. It was like really, really cool. I get there. They go, the dolphin study, something happened with it. We can't do it anymore. So we have you on a Nile crocodile and fish study now. And I was like, I'll take it. That's really cool. Yeah. So I ended up doing research on Nile crocodile and Mozambique tilapia. And our question basically was, there are a lot of these Nile crocodile and fish that are popping up dead along the Olifants River system, which is kind of along the Mozambique like river timeline. It spreads through like South Africa and a whole bunch of different countries down there. A lot of people rely on fish there. However, because they're dying, people were like, is what we're eating safe? Because all of these animals are obviously turning up with something in the water. What it ended up being was pansteatitis, which is a fatty acid lipid disease that the best way I can phrase it is it's when your like insides blow up kind of like a balloon. They basically get so irritated and so messed up that your balloon fills up with water, and instead of like you swimming and being all mobile, you almost turn into a rock and you float, and you have like no mobility access anymore. And so you end up, unfortunately, usually dying. And so they almost like drown themselves, like a lot of fish or crocodile. And so the big question we were asking was, hey, can we do a fatty acid profile on each of these animals, both healthy and diseased, and see whether there's a difference or if it would affect people eating them nutritionally, or lead to some sort of like detective solution as to what is happening with these animals. What we ended up doing is a lot of lab work. So that's where it was like taking all the samples, running them all in. We did extractions. We like separated them. So all the organic matter, I forgot what chemicals we were using. Organic matter would like split to the top almost like oil from water. Take all of those. I forgot what machine we used, but it helped us run the fatty acid profiles. Then we ran a ton of data analysis on them to compare. What we ended up finding out is that the healthy and diseased profiles of both the crocodile and the fish ended up not being unsafe to eat. They're actually fine. There weren't many differences, But what we did find out from talking to people, which is funny because I did all of this work and they ended up being, I mean, it was still good from talking to people, was that one of the biggest contributors to pancreatitis in that river was coal mining and a lot of pollution. And so that led our research question to be like, here's our work, pass it on to the next guys doing the pollution work, because that's kind of where, because our work ended up being so neutral, that led us to our next culprit, basically. So, or the main culprit, maybe they were trying to avoid confronting. So it was really cool. Definitely more challenging. That report was like a big NOAA report. And so it was forever. That was like the first big report I did. It's funny looking back and thinking that was a big report after finishing my master's. But I remember during that time, I was like, this is so much writing.
Did you get to work directly with the fish and the Nile crocodiles, or was it just that you got the samples and you did like the experimental setup analysis portion, or then not directly working with the animals for that one?
Unfortunately, I could not. They actually collected samples right before I got there. And I was so sad. But also, were they going to send some random intern to South Africa to go wrestle a crocodile? Probably not. So,
well, that intern can blow a dart and take out a bear. So
yeah, it was cool though. I like to describe crocodile meat. This sounds so gross. And crocodile fat looks like chicken breast, but really small, almost like jelly beans.
Wow.
Like it's not as intimidating as it looks. It's funny. I was working with them and I was like, this is a Nile crocodile piece. I guess that makes sense.
That's really cool. And it also seems like, again, really good for training purposes. Like you got such a different style of training with the box turtles versus going to this one with the crocodiles and the fish. Did you have?
I had air conditioning too.
Got to be indoors too. Was there any other internships that you had, and what were like the research questions of those?
Yeah. So after that, I would say the next big internship I did, maybe the last, if I remember correctly. Well, so I had like some stuff during college that I would help out with. I helped with animal behavior because we have a black bear center in Blacksburg. It's fitting. We'd have black bears come on campus all the time. And so usually we would have them in a facility. We would study them for a little bit and then we would release them. They're kind of our rotating like, hey, you were on our campus, so we're going to like kind of shift you out. So I did a lot of animal behavior on black bears. That was fun. It's very boring. For anyone that's like very interested in animal behavior, make sure you want to do it because you're really just sitting there watching them for a really long time. But they were cute. My favorite video I got was of a bear actually scratching his back on a tree. And I was like, this is what I live for. Outside of that, we did more population dynamic and tracking work using camera traps. So one of the professors I worked with there has a whole bunch of camera traps in Belize. And so we were trying to track animal counts with camera traps, which basically, if you don't know what they are, they look like almost camo cams. They're like, I don't know, they almost look like the original GoPro, but really, really fat. You tie them to trees, you leave them running there. You come in every few days or few weeks, whatever your time frame is, to change out the battery or to get your like film, and then you change it back. And then you have some intern like me watch it for several hours and track whatever you see. I would see jaguars, wild turkey, a whole bunch of like really cool animals there. So you kind of like learn the wildlife of Belize. Sometimes you kind of learn the same animal. Jaguars really do have unique spots, which is kind of cool. I guess they're rings instead of spots. Those were like probably the beginner things I was put into. Always like never be afraid to ask for work, because I promise you they always have work for you to do. But always try and get the paid ones afterwards. But when you start out, you're probably not going to get paid anything. But the last thing I did, so after the whole Mozambique tilapia, now crocodile internship, of course, it came back to people. I think I saw someone in chat say that too. And that's when I had taken that human dimensions class in my senior year. I think it was senior year, maybe it was junior year, because I guess I was doing this as an independent study, actually. It wasn't an internship. But I ended up working with that professor because I found what she said to be so enlightening. And so I ended up doing a sentiment analysis on a killer whale in the Puget Sound. If anyone, I don't know if anyone here remembers, there is this whale, she's still alive actually, called Tahlequah. She actually went viral multiple times because she's the whale whose calf died and carried around for several weeks afterwards. And the big thing we wanted to do as human dimensions social science researchers on the side of wildlife is understand why people felt so connected to her. And so we did a sentiment analysis using wildlife value orientations, which basically means like, how do you view an animal and how do you anthropomorphize them sometimes? There's mutualism, which like you feel one with animals, probably me. There's domination, where you tend to see them more as like meat or as like resources, which is again, like, I guess hunting is the best example for that. There's pluralists, which see it both ways. And then there are distanced people that don't really see it either way because they're not really connected to wildlife at all to care or have an opinion. All of them are valid. And so we basically did a study on that, plus feelings of anthropomorphism, which is when you place feelings, emotions, or human characteristics on an animal or some inanimate object because you just wanted to have it. And what we did in that whole research study was basically go through tons of social media posts and comments on her viral, moment, because it was everywhere. And from that, we also compared it to other wildlife moments. And basically, it's just kind of what we all kind of already knew, maybe, is that some animals get anthropomorphized and loved a lot more than others. And it tends to be, I forget what they're called, trophy animals, I believe. So like pandas, killer whales. The really cute ones get a lot of attention and tend to be looked at more affectionately than maybe like ants or bugs. So
or like the ugly fish, right? That collapsed out as well.
Yeah. And because of that, sometimes people are also more likely to make more change for those trophy animals than you do the smaller ones that we also have to fight a lot for. So we were doing a lot of that. And that more so was kind of like a fun independent project. And I really enjoyed it because we got to learn a lot about people, read a lot of really funny comments and replies and posts and stuff. But also, I think that's kind of where I realized, I really, really like understanding how people think about animals. And I think part of it's because I love talking to people about animals. But like working with animals was really fun in the other internships. But I tend, during those experiences, I kind of was alone the whole time. And so I kind of was yearning for that social connection again, I think.
We had some questions in the chat about how you did the analysis for this type of data, for the sentiment analysis. Like, did you use machine learning, deep learning, especially then when you're comparing to other like sentiments as well of other animals, like how to do that comparison across? How robust do you feel the data is when taking from social media? How does one do that kind of interpretation?
It's tough. So for looking at it, just the killer whale stuff, we did a lot of qualitative data. So some of it kind of being more subjective than others, but I think that's part of what people kind of have to realize. So we did a lot of like interdata reliability and analysis. So a lot of it is when you do qualitative or quant data or any sort of mixed data, you end up having to make sure that you cross-check things so that they're statistically significant still. Because obviously, even though it's subjective, you don't want someone being like, this person hates animals and this person loves animals, be kind of filling in the same box. So a lot of interreliability studies that we did were between me and other people who were looking at the same data sheet on social media in general.
Because that seems, again, like it would be really, really challenging from the perspective you're trying to do these comparisons. And how do you even take in tone, right? Like, I know there might be commonalities within the language, but like processing that, what's your end value? Like, what's the enough number where you feel that this is a good enough number? And I guess, what were your takeaways? What were your conclusions?
So, I guess like the thing I want to talk about most is I think the toughest part of transitioning from doing like a field study versus a lab study versus like a qualitative, more human dimension study is I've always been like a traditionally quantitative person. And it wasn't until that project that my advisor, like our professor, was basically like, you need to drop all of the numbers and focus on like the mixed points of view and the qualitative side of stuff. And it's going to take you a while to realize that qualitative research is like just as valid in its own way when you're looking at how people feel, especially about animals, because it's really hard to quantify them. And so I think the hardest part for me was kind of realizing and getting used to qualitative science, because for a really long time, I didn't really think that those two worlds blended together. Like there was always like human wildlife conflict and conversations, but I figured, hey, if I talk about my numbers and give this to somebody, that they will care, versus what we were doing there was you were basically only talking to people, or really only looking at things people said or felt, and everything was written or spoken, versus like traditional data. And so I think for me, that was probably the most challenging part. And now I'm like very comfy in qualitative science because that's actually more of what my master's was in. But I would say overall, our conclusions were very much, again, mixed. We had a lot of like actual stats, which, oh my God, it was so long ago. I feel old that I don't remember like the numbers for it. A lot of like everything pretty much was statistically significant from what I remember when it came to the difference between ambassador or trophy animals versus like everybody else, because it's just so prominently like if you give someone some sort of beautiful animal, they tend to love it because they just feel, I don't know what it is, they just feel more connected to them, versus if you give somebody like this rare random bird, sometimes it's harder. And then when you give somebody a bug or something, it's usually like the hardest thing to get people in, or even like a fungus or something that you should care about. And so we saw that in each category. The middle was definitely more funky, but when you have iconic species versus especially the ones that you traditionally think are unlovable, even though they're not, and then everything kind of in the middle, that all checked out. A lot of the qualitative stuff just said the same thing, but without the numbers. It was, I love killer whales. Killer whales are my family. I have decorations. I buy merchandise. It was like above and beyond. The middle was like, I really like them. I think they're good for the environment. You know, they keep things balanced, versus like, oh, these things deserve to all die. Like it was very much like, oh, like I do not like that at all. I don't want to look at it. It's fine if they just never do anything. I never want to get involved. So it was very much like a range, but it matched the numbers because you would see it. You know, it's just kind of verbalizing it versus not seeing the number in it. But
that's really cool that the data played out that way, then that it was enough clear-cut differences where you could have these nice clusters and have those predictions. I see that there is a clear then trajectory as how this took you to your master's degree. Would you mind taking us down that route of like, all right, so after all this background experience that you've had, turtles, crocodiles, fish, a whale in social media with the human relations, catching bears, how did that transition you to your master's degree? And what exactly, if you could define what that master's degree is for those who might not be familiar with it?
Yes, I will. Don't worry. That is, it's funny because my husband asked me before I like got on with you. He was like, did you review your thesis to like just be like ready? I was like, this thing is like in my blood at this point. Like, I don't need any review of this. So my journey after I graduated with my Bachelor's of Science, I graduated 2020. So it was kind of a rough year to graduate. After that, I had been wanting to go to get a master's that's just been my dream forever. I applied to one, I got it. And then I lost all my funding because of COVID. So it left me with like a year and a half of reapplying and trying it all again. And during that time, I started streaming, but I also started attending a lot of online conferences to just make sure that what I wanted to do was what I wanted to do. And originally my master's, I was more looking at human-wildlife conflict, kind of the bridge between what I had done before, like maybe some research, but also science communication. But the more I was going to conferences, the more I kind of kept falling in love over and over when people would talk about, I don't know, like people and wildlife versus like, here's what I did and here's me communicating it. There's just so many different bridges. So I realized that those were all of the presentations I was attending. And that I also highly recommend if you can get your university or something, they pay you to like attend even an online conference, partial conference, etc. Do it, because it's also how I realized what I wanted to do. So I reapplied to my master's. This time I was going in on a project with, well, actually my first project fell through, but we ended up working it out. I have had a really weird graduate experience, but we don't have to go into that. What I ended up doing for my master's is I focused it on environmental justice and urban planning, and I was with the U.S. Forest Service for that. So what my research on, it was a national and a community level case study. So it was this big narrative of how the U.S. is growing trees or trying to create green spaces to combat or at least mitigate climate change, or to create green spaces in cities, et cetera, especially in cities, because cities tend to be blocky, have a lot of like urban heat islands, et cetera. It's really, really bad there. So what we ended up doing is we did a national survey of a ton of actual agencies, nonprofits, et cetera, any sort of environmental adjacent thing. We tried reaching out. We're like, hey, please answer our survey about what you think trees do for you, what your goals are, who you're working with, like what it's all looked like for you, et cetera, et cetera. After that, we did a community level study, basically asking the same questions, but to people who are impacted by what those agencies are doing. My research focused on in Louisville, Kentucky. And now I know how to say it properly. When I first started, I was like, Louisville. And I went to Kentucky. They were like, it's Louisville. Don't you dare say Louisville. And it was really cool. I got to be in Louisville for a little bit. And I got to interview a lot of the people who ended up taking my survey. We did follow-up interviews with them. And a lot of what the story ended up being was national organizations being like, hey, I think we're doing a great job. Here's everything we're doing. We're planting trees, creating green spaces in these neighborhoods, especially these, Black and brown neighborhoods that don't really have trees. A lot of it having to do with gentrification, redlining in the past, that still prevails today and is still very much something that we are dealing with in the United States and elsewhere. And so they're like, okay, we're trying to help out our most vulnerable communities. We're doing a great job. High five. I would go to these communities and they would be like, hey, it's great to have trees. We like trees, but they're pushing us out of our neighborhoods. And the reason is because when you add green space to neighborhoods that haven't had them, it tends to gentrify, increase property taxes, et cetera, of those people. And so their relationship with nature ends up becoming really fuzzy and muddy. Because they want green spaces and they care about nature, they care about the wildlife there. They even love trees, but the trees aren't really helping us unless there are other things put in place to protect us or something else. So my entire master's thesis was basically on pulling these stories together with Likert scale quant analysis and a ton of interviews of both national and community level folks, and creating this basically story for US Fish and Wildlife of being like, here are your numbers, here are what people are saying, but also here are things to consider, because my job basically was, hey, here are the good things and here are the bad things. Here are your improvement areas. How can we actually do urban greening and environmental justice in a city that wants it, but equitably? So I think that kind of was the best way for me to merge both of my passions, because although it's not animals, I fell in love with trees more. And also I kind of learned about how people perceive wildlife and nature more in a way that I'd never even thought of. Because I think when I talk about it on stream, because I've talked about my research so much, because I was working on it for years and crying over it on stream, that other people didn't realize it either, that these things kind of happen. And it happens with wildlife and it happens with trees and it happens with a bunch of other stuff too. So my master's was really cool for that, but also I think opened my eyes in a way that I can't shut them anymore. So now I don't really know what to do, but I'm done with my master's.
So how difficult was it to do those interviews? It's like you said, there's a very drastic difference from what the agency thought that they were doing well, which they thought everything. And then it's, almost like earth shattering in terms of the difference, right? Of like, this isn't great. We're being forced out of our homes. I would imagine that's not an easy interview to conduct, and being able to get that kind of information. How did you cope with that? And then how did you standardize that kind of information as well? Because that seems like it's very different from like the crocodiles, where it's like you get a number out, right? But it's almost like a little bit more in line with the social media posts and the analysis you did there, but it's firsthand and you have the body language to go with it. So it seems like it could be, complicated.
Yeah, I would say, and this is something that, so my committee was made up of both qualitative researchers and quantitative researchers, and it was because my research was so mixed methods. I also had a lot of really cool champions of DEIJA+ on my committee as well, people who have done ethnographies on like trans folks, etc., like people that are amazing, that do really cool research, so that I could really understand the impact I have as a researcher when I'm talking to people, but also on what I am writing. So the big thing we were doing was, reflection statements consistently, even just like myself, without even interviewing people, is where am I coming from? How does me talking to somebody impact them? A lot of people don't often think about that in research. That research can be very subjective given who writes it, but especially when you're interviewing or working with different communities, how me as a Latin, bisexual woman impacts your answers when you're talking to me, and when it comes to really vulnerable or careful conversations. So I would say for me, honestly, I had a easier time talking to the community members than I did the national folks. And I think for me is because, again, like now that we're talking about women in STEM and everything, I think that I connect more on a community level with people than sometimes I do at national levels with people that are higher up because I'm not taken as seriously. But I also think that as somebody who is systematically marginalized, I didn't really have to press or pry at all for people to tell me what they thought. I think that me coming in with my like funny little outfits and just kind of being straight up with them, I never really pressed. There's a whole bunch of things you do in an interview where, you know, we have IRB, a bunch of things to confirm ethically, morally. I was never like, tell me or anything. It was very open ended. But I do think that in a large part of the way, a lot of the people that I talked to felt comfortable talking to me about what they did end up sharing because maybe they saw a little bit of that struggle at me too. And sometimes maybe they didn't. That's totally fine. I always tell my community, you're not always going to be everyone's cup of tea. Some people don't want to talk to you. You just have to get over it. And it's totally fine. But I think for me, coping with the things that I heard, if anything, was definitely a little saddening.
Yeah.
And a lot of the work that I do in environmental justice, and I mean, even like wildlife conservation has always been a little sad. But I think if anything, it was more invigorating and it just kind of fueled my determination more to get things done. I think that's just kind of how I cope with it or I don't know, want to press forward after things like that is, okay, you shared with me this thing and now I'm going to like really make something happen out of it because I don't want your words to not go anywhere. I want this to really make an impact. So how it looks like in my thesis and how we wrote it, I don't know. I think it's very structured very, very differently. In any university you go to, my thesis was basically like a 4-parter. There was like a beginning summary, like overall, what is this thesis about? Document. The second one was an article that's actually hopefully going to be published. I'm sending that one. My advisor is really cool. He basically had me write my second chapter as what we would send to the journals that we would want to submit it to in the exact format. That one was the national study. The third one was my community study. And my last one was everything put together for U.S. Forest Service. And that was more of a practitioner's guide. It was still super long, but it was less like, here's every single tiny thing that we did, unless you just want to read it in the article. More so like, we know you're practitioners, we know you want answers. Here is it kind of a little bit more straight to the point. How we ended up kind of splitting it up in those individual articles was that for the national study, it was definitely more quantitative because their interviews weren't as at length or long as the community ones. They kind of put everything in their survey and they were like, we either don't want to talk to you or we're just going to re-emphasize everything we said. And I was like, cool, makes my life easy. So Likert scale, just basically taking those numbers, taking means, just pretty simple stuff when it comes to survey work. Well, it's not simple, but it's simple to me now. And then the next article, because the survey ended up kind of not matching everything I ended up hearing in the interviews, ended up being more of a whole, I wouldn't say narrative. There's probably a better word for it. It ended up basically being a retelling of my interviews with the survey results that were quantitative being supplementary, because the survey results were like, hey, you could tell they wanted to expand on them. It definitely wasn't the truest thing, but what really was the gold in those conversations was the interview. And so in that article was basically us focusing on, hey, here are the things that came from this interview that you should be aware of. A lot of it was the gentrification. A lot of it was, the history of Louisville, et cetera, that they all spilled and told me that I think that if you're going to work in another city, that somebody in that city as well, even though it's not in Louisville, might also tell you in another part of the United States. And it's going to vary by city, but you should be aware of like how people feel when it comes to sense of place, when it comes to how they're impacted, et cetera. And so that one definitely dives more into the actual DEIJA plus side of things. So I wrote that one with the help of my ethnographer committee member. He was the one that has been doing interviews his whole life, observing people his whole life, etc. That one was basically everything that we had worked on together, thrown into there without leaving really anything out. Because again, I was like, I don't know if it's going to get me in trouble, but I'm going to tell people what these folks said because it's important. And then the last one was everything mixed together in just a much more concise way than what I'm probably mentioning now. But yeah.
Did you find that it influenced the surveys? Because you found that disconnect, right, between the interviews and the surveys, but presumably says we got to change the surveys maybe around a little bit. to reflect what actually is going on. Was that something that happened, or like what was an actionable item that you could have gotten from this work, or is it just like so bogged down that it's really difficult to get an actionable item beyond just like passing on this information?
I guess, what do you mean actionable item?
Like, how can we fix what you found? Basically, like, you found that there is this like negative space, like that's association now with nature, and it's like also forcing people out. Like, is all you can really do is guidance, or can you actually be like, look, y'all, we need to do this. Here's the data.
Honestly, so it's kind of a blend. It's like looking at your data, looking at your interviews, and what we ended up doing is providing recommendations based off of, like, for example, like theories or other research reports that we've gotten information from. So, for example, a lot of people that ended up planting trees didn't actually really talk to the people in the communities. Recommendation number 1, talk to your communities. So it was kind of more of like that. What we saw the disconnects being ended up being the recommendations for U.S. wildlife with like, hey, here are other reports that have said the same thing. Here are things that have shown success. Here are things that have shown trust building, because a lot of the times there was not a lot of trust when it came to people that were planting trees and the communities that were being involved as well. Lots of different things like that. So although there were a lot of numbers, it was a lot of like, hey, here are action items given based off of the survey and the interviews, but it ended up basically being like, here's how you do things equitably. Less so on the numbers of trees, etc. The biggest thing with numbers of trees was basically like planting an F ton of trees doesn't actually fix your problem. But more so being like, hey, here are some broader skills, things to consider. And then here are resources outside of that for your individual situations, which like maybe I can't go into, but because every org plants trees differently, like there were like the national orgs doing it. There are like the federal org states. There's like nonprofits doing it. They all do it differently. And so your recommendations have to be a little broad, but also specific enough where they can follow them. And then after that is when you probably talk to someone like me or some sort of consultant where you're like, hey, DEI, JA plus person, urban planning person, justice person, does this look right numerically, qualitatively, etc.? And that's why those jobs are important, because if you don't have someone in those positions, or if you don't have someone who can provide you with that input on what you're doing, you can lose trust, you can hurt people on accident, you can hurt animals on accident, you can do a whole bunch of different things that cross boundaries, cross lines that you can't always recover from. And the most important thing to me with science is just transparency and connection with the people that you want to care about your things, especially because you don't want to hurt them. You want people to care about things as much as you do. And the biggest thing that we learned was, as much as you love trees, and if you're working for a tree org planting stuff, it doesn't mean that other people are going to appreciate the trees the same way because you're not looking at it the same way as them. So that was my big takeaway. Those are kind of our end action items. And that's like only one step of, I'm assuming, U.S. Forest Service is going to do of all this other stuff.
So a potentially naive question, but how does then one go about either building trust or rebuilding trust with these communities? Because presumably they still want to plant trees, but what is then, or maybe we don't know the answer to this, which is also fine. What is then the way that you can actually rebuild that trust while still having the benefit of the trees, but not forcing people out of the neighborhood?
There's a lot of things. I think sometimes as researchers, because I've seen it happen, and in a way, like I kind of did it, and I am fine acknowledging that, is I feel like a lot of times we parachute science. We go in, we do our stuff, and then we leave. That's not very trustworthy. You really want someone who's there on the ground for a long time, who like genuinely shows compassion and care for your community to be there doing the work that they're doing. One way to remedy that is probably partnering with people in that area and building a connection, a network of people there to do it, instead of just it being the state or it being like this one organization controlling all parts. One thing that Louisville was working on was working with their university, working with nonprofits, working with churches, working with people who would be able to finally get other community members in on the conversations, because sometimes it really just does become institutional and it's very gatekeepy. It's really hard to keep people in those conversations or engaged. A lot of it also is, having multiple languages, having childcare, having these like public forums and meetings, et cetera, that people can actually attend and get to, providing food, maybe spending a little bit more money and time before doing the actual planting, before doing the actual work, to get to know your community. Those events are really important. They're often skipped upon a lot by a lot of people because they just figure that, hey, well, it's really hard. It's tough because like at an organizational level, you probably have a timeline to the funding you have to spend immediately. And so it's really hard. And I totally get their side too. I'm not trying to villainize them. But at the same time, it is also wild that absolutely no community building is really incorporated in those grants either, which is again something to consider. So I see where they're coming from, but also like, oh my God, we need to do better at the initial steps of like what we're trying to do instead of like focusing on all of the post we've done this already data, which I think we often focus on is, hey, we did this thing, how did we do? And then everybody's like, we hate you. And it's like, wait, why? So I think a lot of it has to do with just having more people in those positions and kind of thinking about that more. Sometimes it stinks because, you know, it ends up being like time out of your own day, maybe like volunteer time you have to do to build trust. But trust really is important. Outside of that is understanding the legality of what you're doing too, and like how it will impact people. A lot of people are talking about rent control, et cetera, when it comes to adding green space to areas. There's a lot of stuff even above my pay grade that people were talking about and recommendations that we were looking at that, you know, revolve around like economics and property and like keeping it and all sorts of stuff is like private versus public versus like how does this apartment complex work when you have all these people inside of it that have their own opinions. So it's just all these external things to consider. But I think the biggest thing for trust is really just as a scientist, if you can, making the time for it. But again, I know it's not always possible. It just kind of stinks that it is that way.
I really like it kind of dovetails back to your story in undergrad as well, like learning the importance of interacting with people, having community buy-in before you can do anything on the conservation biology side of things too. It kind of all ties together, you being a science communicator. And I just have to say, I know we're running a little over, but this conversation has been so much fun. Like you are so good at explaining what you were working on and like what you were doing. So it something worked, Jules. Like this is absolutely incredible. And it's like, I think you're very much like conveying the value of all of these different types of research avenues. And it's really, really cool to hear about. What is next for HyJules?
Oh, so not to get into the too nitty gritty, but I graduated in November. My advisor basically held my hand and was like, you need to take a few months off because this has been a lot on you. And I was like, you're absolutely right. I've taken a few months off, focused on content. For now, I'm doing full-time content. We will see about returning back to wildlife biology, conservation biology, social science in general. Right now, though, things we talked about are important. Jobs that I think I'd be great for are no longer being funded. So, or are kind of slipping away from me. So that's kind of my dilemma at the moment. And so right now, a lot of it is keeping track of those jobs, keeping track of like kind of what I can do. I still want to be within the community. I think a lot of it will have to be volunteer, nonprofit work on my end in the meantime, but to keep some bundles of joy and to just continue sparking creativity and just, I don't know, passion in my life. I think right now full-time content creation is helping with that a lot, but I'm hoping that the pathway ahead becomes a little bit more clear, but it definitely is very much like a community. Let's get through this moment together for a while.
It's definitely a lot of uncertainty in a lot of different avenues of science right now. Yeah. Well, hopefully you just put you in front of the funding agencies and tell them like, look, y'all, here's what we got to do. What do you think was the most rewarding thing in doing your master's degree?
My favorite part was talking to the community members in Louisville. I think working with communities that I love and care about, whether or not I'm a part of them, is always going to be my favorite part of everything. Like, I care about things very, very deeply. And those conversations I still think about every day. Like, those people were so lovely to talk to. And even if they had like nothing nice to say about what my research was about, I think about it and I maybe don't remember everything, but I like will never forget it. And I just think it was so valuable for me to learn because some of it was hard. But I think that sometimes the hard, uncomfortable stuff really ends up hitting you in the best of places and like right places to make you better. But also some of the other things that I resonated with deeply just made me feel more validated too. And so, yeah, I think it was just that connection of it. And also just hearing some people were very much like, I love trees, but they don't love me. And sometimes that really hits you hard because you may love something a lot. And sometimes it feels like it doesn't really like show itself the right way, or sometimes it feels like things can't work. But, you know, there's kind of ways to get yourself to there. And so I don't know. I think that's probably my favorite part of it was talking to the community members. I love talking to the national folks as well, but I kind of liked the realness of people. I liked uncovering kind of the dirt. I felt kind of like a detective, but also I just felt like I could make a lot of change when I talked to them, and they just I felt like they really wanted it too. So I think it was just very empowering for me and for them both together.
That is really, really cool. As we're rounding out, I'd like to ask you the same question that we've asked all of our other guests so far, and we're going to
Mhm.
continue it on as we're celebrating Women's History Month and celebrating incredible women in STEM. What does it mean to you to be a woman in STEM?
Ooh, that's a hard question. I think being a woman in STEM, I think it's just very empowering. And I feel like sometimes I forget I'm a woman in STEM. And I wonder if I assume other women feel this way. Maybe not, though. Maybe like other people in general do. I have a lot of time dealing with like imposter syndrome. And sometimes I'm treated like I'm not a scientist at all. And so I think that being a woman in STEM really means kind of rising above those feelings and really owning the things that you have done. And a lot of things I tell my community is every now and then I'll look back at like my CV or I'll make a list of even the things I've done that week. And then I look back and I'm like, you're a bad bitch. Because sometimes I really do forget that I can do really anything I set my mind to. And I think that for me, specifically being a woman in STEM, I love talking about it. And that the reason I've done co-working and the reason I always talk about my research is because I hope that me talking about it resonates to others who want to be in my field. I hope that it opens their eyes to the things that I've learned and that I love, but also like maybe out there is like a small girl, Latino girl who doesn't often see a woman in STEM look like her and know that she can do it or not and believes that she can. So I think that that's probably what it means to me is just trying to be the best role model I can, both for my culture and who I am as a person, but also for the science that I believe in.
Thank you for being an ambassador to science. That is an incredible answer, and thank you so very much for everything you do and recognizing too that you are a role model for a lot of people out there, right? And that is a big, big heckin' deal. Like all that you've gone through, honestly, should be a book, and just like and maybe probably just have it as reading material for kids in school. And I would love to have your story be told to even more people because it is awe-inspiring, right? From the first gen American, first gen college student, doing so much in your undergrad, so much in your master's, from that love of the original biology with your dad to who you are now. Thank you so much for sharing your incredible, inspirational story with us. It's absolutely incredible. Thank you so very much, Jules.
Oh, well, thank you for having me. I know I like mentioned it when I was in my stream earlier, but I really do love what you're doing here. And like I said, I often forget or I'm not always treated like I'm a smarter scientific person. And so I feel like being on here has really validated a lot of those feelings. And if you ever want to talk just in general, not even like on stream, please do. I'm a big nerd. I'm a big dork. I would love to talk science all the time. I don't even get to talk about it as much as I like to, honestly. But it is everything that I love and everything that I enjoy doing. So
Well, ma'am, there is not an imposter thing about you, but I understand the feeling, especially like you were saying, if one thing that we always highlight too is there is this disparity between who is seen and who's visible as a scientist, and you are on the front lines making that difference. And so you are not an imposter, you are an advocate for science, and thank you for everything you do. And anything that you all want to say or promote, please do so. Thank you so much for your time and for joining us today.
thank you. I guess the only two things I have to promote are one, I'm a full-time content creator, so any support is very appreciated. But the second thing really is don't stop fighting for the science that you believe in. Right now, a lot of stuff is happening, but as much as people try and silence science, we cannot be, we have not been, and we never will be. So just know that there is community and there's a lot of power in science. And although we're nerdy, listen, we can put up a good fight. So
Well said. Thank you so very much again, Jules. And
I appreciate it. Thank you for having me.
always have a great evening.
You too. Bye.